Welcome to Ask the Expert with noted radio host Steve Sleeper. Each week, Steve interviews entrepreneurs and professionals and shares their intriguing stories of success and service. Now, here's radio veteran Steve Sleeper.
Our guest today is Doug Noll, and Doug's an attorney. First of all, hi, Doug. How you doing?
I'm great, Steve. How are you today?
No, I'm good. Now, I started by saying Doug's an attorney, but I got to tell you, you're different than any other attorney I've ever interviewed, Doug. So why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself, and then it's an interesting story about what you do.
I am a lawyer turned peacemaker. For 22 years, I was a hardcore trial lawyer, and then through a series of events that caused me to change my perspective and view of how things work in the world, I went back to school and got my master's degree in peacemaking and conflict studies in the mid-1990s and left the practice of law in 2000 to become a mediator and a peacemaker. And today, I work in intractable conflicts. I do some litigated disputes, but mostly my work is in non-litigated disputes where the relationships are at stake and there's a lot of high emotion and anger and dysfunction. And in addition to that, as I know you'll want to ask me more about, is in 2010, my colleague Laura Coffer and I started the Prison of Peace Project, where we train lifers and long-termers how to become peacemakers and mediators in their prison environments.
Let's talk about the mediation and peacemaker thing, because I know in many cases you're dealing with families where there's issues between a couple of members of the family. They're not agreeing on stuff, but even more than that, there's a lot of anger. Talk about that.
So, family conflicts, and I'll separate. You can separate family conflicts into two big buckets. One big bucket is what we could call marital disputes, which is the obvious divorce and child custody and support and all that. I do some of those, but not a lot. Then in the other bucket, you have family conflicts that typically arise over money, and these can, broadly stated, fall either into estates and trust problems where people are fighting over the meaning of a trust or the distribution of an estate or something like that, and family business conflicts, where you have family members. Typically, the conflicts start arising in the third generation of the business, and after the last parent of the second generation has passed away. And all these conflicts follow very predictable paths. So, and there's always anger, and there's always deep mistrust, and there is almost always overt hostility between family members. They could be siblings or cousins, or it could be multi-generational conflict. And the problem is that for most families have never really developed, especially family businesses, have never really developed the skills to manage disagreements and conflicts well. They use the rules that were developed implicitly in their families and in their personal lives. But when you apply this to a situation where there's a lot of money at stake or there's a family business involved, those rules don't work. And so relationships break down very quickly. People become estranged from one another, become very angry. And their choice is, do we hire junkyard lawyers to destroy our wealth, or do we bring in somebody like Noll who can help us figure out what we need to do with ourselves? And that's typically the choice that people are faced with. And my process is very different than the typical litigated mediation, where there's very little time spent together in one room, what we would call a joint session. In my work, it's all joint session. We never caucus. I don't care what's going on in the room. I never separate people out. And the reason for that is because neuroscience shows us that the only way you can rebuild trust is to have people confront each other. Once you start separating people, all that does is deepen the mistrust, deepen the anger, deepen the bad emotions. People have to confront these very painful feelings they have. They have to confront each other. And my job is to keep it all in process and keep it under relative control, because I have to let them have their emotions, but de-escalate them, calm them down, move them into problem solving, and get them focusing on on, first of all, the fact that they have 6 needs that have to be met. And then as we meet those needs, then we can start looking at the problem from a business perspective and start saying, okay, so what do we need? What is really being called for here? And in almost every conflict, it's never about money. Even though the money seems to be what it's all about, millions of dollars of this or that, it's really about the relationships and how people have felt abused by one another and how their individual needs have not been met in one way or another. And that's what causes the conflict. And so the task is to get those 6 needs met. That de-escalates people, and then we can solve the business problem. So that's kind of in a nutshell what I do. Very different than what most mediators do.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very interesting. Now, the other thing you were talking about was prison of peace, and that's also fascinating to me. Talk more about that.
So in 2009, my colleague Laurel Coffer, who was a mediator in Southern California, received a letter from a woman serving a life sentence without possibility of parole at the largest, most violent women's prison in the world, which was located in Central California, not too far from where I live. And this woman, Susan Russo, was asking if Laurel would be willing to come into the prison and teach a group of women who are all lifers mediation and peacemaking skills because they were tired of the violence. And since I live fairly close to the prison and I'm a secondary black belt and Laurel had known me for many years, she called me and read me the letter and said, "What do you think?" And I thought about it for a second. I said, if this is real, we should do it. And so we did. And it took us 6 months to get permission to start, but we started in 2010 with a 12-week curriculum where we take inmates who have no skills in peacemaking whatsoever. And by the end of the 12 weeks, they are skilled mediators. And today, that we were doing this all pro bono and the women's prison was repurposed to a men's prison in 2012. We told the women we would follow them to the other women's prisons, which we did because they were transferred out. And then the warden called us and said, "We're bringing men in here. We want you to do prison of peace for the men." And we said, "No, we're not getting paid. We can't do it. Doing the women is breaking us, bankrupting us." But then we said yes. So we started with the men in 2013. And then finally, the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation put out some innovative grant proposals, and we ultimately were awarded over $1 million in grants. And now we're operating in non-California prisons, and we have a colleague who's doing prison of peace in Greece with 4 prisons, and we'll be starting in Connecticut later this year. So it's expanded rapidly, and what's really cool is we were hiring a bunch of young lawyers, all of whom are either lawyers or lawyers with LLMs or master's degrees in peacemaking and conflict studies or conflict resolution. And they're coming in and starting to do the work with us. So we're able to pass everything we've learned down to the next generation. And it's really challenging work. It is very long hours, very poor pay, but it's some of the most rewarding work I've ever done. In fact, yesterday I was at Corcoran State Prison, training for 4 hours, and when I'm done here today, I drive down to Wasco State Prison, and we begin a mediation workshop down there with a cadre of about 30 men. So, and they've been training a year to get to where they are right now. We no longer can do the 12-week intensives that we used to do because it's just so difficult to get space and time on the prison yards to work with the inmates. But it's very powerful.
Yeah. Wow. Your website, by the way, is DougNoll.com, N as in North, O-double-L, DougNoll.com, and there's just tons of information there about what you do and stuff and blogs and all that kind of content. But one of the things I noticed on your website is the Safe Schools project. Now that's pretty important right now. Talk about that.
Yeah, obviously gun violence in schools is on the rise, and a lot of people have talked about a lot of different ways of dealing with that problem. I had the opportunity a couple of years ago to introduce restorative practices into a high school, an inner city high school, and the feeder schools, the middle schools that we're feeding into it, working with administration and staff and teachers to teach them my de-escalation skills. And what they found was that when they applied, but first of all, they found that the skills that I taught them were the most valuable skills they'd ever learned, and they were able to relate to kids in a completely different way, especially kids who were misbehaving. And by using these deep de-escalation skills, they were able to take kids who might be prone to violence and completely get them calmed down and get them reintegrated back into the student population and rid themselves of most of the behavioral problems. So with that experiment having gone by, I am now advocating that schools invest in, or school districts invest in, and it doesn't have to be me, but invest in de-escalation training where the teachers actually learn how to de-escalate an angry kid in the classroom in about 30 seconds and get that kid back into learning mode rather than sending the kid out to the principal's office or some other disciplinary thing which everybody knows doesn't work, or alienating a kid, which is most of these kids that become shooters are alienated because they have been either taunted or ridiculed or bullied or feel completely excluded, or they have mental illness. They can be spotted, and instead of ignoring them, teachers and administrators can start connecting with these kids in a very deep and empathic way. And the skill sets are very counterintuitive, but it's all based on neuroscience and what I call the new science of human behavior. And once you learn these skills, everything changes. It's amazing. The results are just absolutely phenomenal. So I talk about the Safe Schools Project with the idea of teaching people how to use these de-escalation skills that I actually teach in the prison as well. They're universal in their application, and using them in schools to prevent conflict and violence from erupting by creating these deep bonds with kids. So that's what that's all about. I think it's more effective than arming teachers with handguns, personally.
Yeah, right. Okay, my next question is the workshops. I notice you do workshops on your website.
I do, and what I'm doing now, I get hired to do the de-escalation workshops. The biggest challenge in doing workshops, especially if you're going into an organization or an institution, is that to learn all of these skills. First of all, there's a whole host of skills to be mastered. And you can't master these in a 1 or 2 day workshop. And what we learned in Prison of Peace is that we really want to embed these skills deeply into people. It has to be a consistent learning process for at least 8 weeks. So, for example, in the prison project, we might have a day or two of intense training, but then we'll be back the next week for follow-up and check-in and more training. And we'll do that for weeks and weeks and weeks. For example, this summer in 2 prisons, we'll be in every single week training inmates. And it's that repetition and practice and accountability that causes people to change. So I finally recognized that, and recognized that the expense of having me come back week after week after week is prohibitive. So now I'm online, and people can actually have one-on-one training with me online, and I have lessons and all kinds of stuff that people do, and then we meet for an hour or two every week on Zoom in a private seminar, and so it's much less expensive, and that's how I'm getting a cadre of people trained up in these skills, and eventually I want to take my students who are willing to spend the time and money to develop this and have them become like me, teachers and trainers, wherever they are, teaching in the schools, doing prison work, doing community work, doing whatever it is, to teach these de-escalation skills and virally spread these ideas out through our communities. And if people are interested in that, if they go to the homepage at dougnoll.com, I have a master class. It's free, and people just take the master class, and if it resonates with you, then you can schedule a call with me, and we can talk about whether or not my work is something that people want to engage in. The Internet's a wonderful thing. We can spread a lot of knowledge around pretty quickly and relatively inexpensively compared to even 5 years ago. It's pretty amazing.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And one of the questions I was going to ask is, have you figured out how to clone yourself yet? But I guess
I'm working on it. I've gotten all these skills and knowledge from as a student of human conflict, and now I'm at a place in my life where I really am trying to pass the information down. And so I teach graduate school, so I'm trying to pass this on to my graduate students, and we are, of course, working. Like I said, we've got 3 or 4 young lawyers working for us who've decided to become peacemakers rather than lawyers, and they're learning, on the job training, and so they will obviously get the knowledge. And then, of course, people that hire me become one of my professional students. I'm hopeful to pass the knowledge on to them too. And slowly, we'll get this information out there.
Yeah, it's good stuff.
And it's fascinating stuff. It's all, it's all based on neuroscience and how we actually behave as human beings is totally different than how we think we behave. How we think we behave is not how we behave at all. It's totally counterintuitive, and it's just fascinating.
Yeah, I believe it. Our guest today is Doug Noll, and I'm going to say probably the easiest way to get in touch with you is go to your website at dougnoll.com. There's a place where you can send you an email, and you can look at your workshops. Is that a safe assumption on my part?
It is a safe assumption. dougnoll.com has a lot of resources on it. It is my primary website for people who want to contact me and become one of my students or learn from me. There's a lot of free resources. You can get access to my last book, De-Escalate, How to Calm an Angry Person in 90 Seconds or Less. And the link to the webinar is there if you want to take the 45-minute masterclass and kind of jump in, dip your toe in the pool in this stuff and see whether or not this stuff resonates with you. And that's probably the easiest and fastest way to get a hold of me. And I'm a one-man shop. I don't have a huge wall of people around me. You contact me. I pick up the phone. I answer the emails. I'm a one-man guy. So I'm accountable to myself and accountable to everybody that contacts me.
Well, Doug, thanks for being on the show today, and good luck with cloning yourself.
Thanks, Steve, and thanks for the opportunity to chat with you. It's been a lot of fun.
Thanks for listening to Ask the Expert with Steve Sleeper. Join us next time as entrepreneurs and professionals share their intriguing stories of success and service.